The main finding is that the average IQ of undergraduate students today is 102, which is only slightly above the general population. Today's guest is Dr. Bob Uttl, who is a cognitive psychologist and professor at Mount Royal University in Canada. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Bob, I discovered you from your meta-analysis, which is called On Average, Undergraduate Students' Intelligence is Merely Average, which this meta-analysis came out last year in 2024. And I guess you could say that the main finding is that the average IQ of undergraduate students today is 102, which is only slightly above the general population of average IQ at 100. Can you summarize your research paper and talk about some of the other findings, how you came to this conclusion, and just give us the bigger overview of this study?
Okay, I will start first with some basic facts about IQ, which some people might not sort of realize. Most people have probably seen something like a bell curve. And so bell curve shows you distribution of IQs, but it also shows you distribution of almost anything which you measure about people. Some people have a longer hair, some people have a shorter hair, but on the average, they have certain hair lengths, right? And most people are sort of in the middle, and then towards both ends, there's fewer and fewer people. And in terms of IQ, how do you measure IQ, right? You can measure it by all sorts of different tests. There's many IQ tests. One of the most common one is so-called Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. First version of that was designed in 1939. And what you do on IQ test is you give people a bunch of tasks. It could be as simple as taking 100 random words from dictionary and then asking people to define each word. If they define it correctly, they get 1 point. If they don't, they get 0 points. Then you summarize how many points everybody got, and let's say that on average they will get 60 points. So that's going to be the average of the task, 60 words, and then there's going to be some standard deviation around it. And once you have this data, you can transform that into so-called IQ point scale. And that IQ point scale, or IQs, are standardized to the mean of 100 and the standard deviation of 15. And you can take any kind of task and standardize it to that type of scale. And when you do this in the 40s with the first Wechsler test, people standardized it to the 100, 15 standard deviation. And then later on, people found out that subsequent generations of people who were born later, can do higher number of tasks on these intelligence tests. So if there was, let's say, some test with 20 puzzles in 1940s, people would solve, let's say, this is fictitious data, 5 puzzles. But people in 2020 can do 15 puzzles. And so we re-standardize the tests, IQ tests, every so often. And so if we give these puzzles to a bunch of people, they do some, 15. We standardize it to IQ 100 and standard deviation 15. So again, mean IQ in 2020 for the population is 100. But those people can do many more puzzles than those people in 1940. This is called Flynn effect, right? General rise in intelligence, raw ability, over last century, basically. So what happened between 1940 and, let's say, 2010 or 2020, whatever it is, raw ability of a general population, meaning everybody in the population, has increased by 0.3 IQ points per year. So that makes it about, between 1940, 60, 70, 85 years, multiplied by 0.3. That gives you about 24 IQ points, something like that, right? And one explanation for that increase in our ability is a massive increase in educational attainment. So in 1940s, 20% of people, let's say, approximately, finished high school. Today it's more than 90%. In 1940s, 4% finished university. Today it's 40% or more. And a bunch of people actually continue, don't get quite 4 years university degree, may get a 3 years degree. And so when you add those, it's about 70%. So you can think of IQ being standardized for current population, but ability has increased over 8 years. One driving force was the increase in educational attainment. And because people who have university degrees have become larger and larger portion of the general population, average IQ of those people with university degrees must have gone down. It's a mathematical necessity. It cannot be in any other way. Once everybody has a university degree, everybody in the population, if that ever happens, then of course, mean IQ of the population will be mean IQ of all the people with university degrees. Sometimes people with PhD have a hard time to understand this concept. And that's in fact what happened to our paper, because it was basically de-accepted because people thought that I don't know what they thought. But that's basically what happened. So the decrease in average IQ of university students is a necessary consequence of increased enrollment in the universities over the last 80 years or whatever you want to sort of count it, right? But what is important to remember is that today's university population is theoretically still more capable than that university population in 1940s. Because Flynn effect says it increased by 0.3, we found about 0.2 per year decrease in universities, so they are still a bit more able in terms of raw ability, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, because basically what you're saying is that every few years that test is essentially reconfigured back to an average. So an average 50 years ago to now, it's still just reconfigured for the general population, even though in 1940, if you were to not reconfigure it, the average IQ now would be like 124 versus the 100 in 1940 that you're referencing.
Exactly. Yeah.
This research paper, this meta-analysis that we're discussing today, on average, undergraduate students' intelligence is merely average, which is the title. So this was accepted in Frontiers, which is a peer-reviewed journal, I think that specializes in psychology, or at least that was what this was going under. So it was accepted, and then it turns out there was a lot of Twitter pushback, and then like a month later, they then pulled it from being accepted. But it seems like they really did they not read the paper then, because they're somehow getting offended for reasons that you didn't say. At least that's kind of what I'm gathering.
Yeah, it's a completely I have never heard of that ever happening, right? So the paper went through peer review. It was peer reviewed by 4 people. It was accepted by chief associate editor at Frontiers for psychology. And, once the paper's accepted, they typeset it and they send you a copy proof. So they send me copy proofs. I fix the copy proofs. And Frontiers has one interesting feature which most journals don't do. Once the paper's accepted, they post the abstract on their webpage. And abstract, of course, is, I don't know how long that abstract was, but let's say 300 words, right? It basically tells you what the problem is, rationale, what was the method, what were the findings, and some kind of a conclusions, implications, right? So that was posted publicly on Frontiers, and within like a week or whatever it was, it had like 50,000 views and 2,000 plus posts on X, and it basically went viral, right? And then I'm sitting at the computer, and suddenly email arrives from Frontiers, and it does this kind of a standard accept and rejection thing, and basically inform me that the paper was rejected. And I was like, what? What is this, right? So I simply replied and said, well, I'm sorry, but you must be mistaken. I just approve copy proofs. And then it turned out, and it took, lots of emailing, including emailing with Frontiers head office about what happened. And they never disclosed what actually happened, except that there were, quote, several posts, unquote, on, quote, X, unquote, that somehow were brought to the Frontiers' attention. And as a result of that, chief editor, right, section of the cognitive science section or whatever it was, decided to pull it. So it was not the associate chief editor who accepted it, but one editor above that, right? And I got this, email about what were the problems with the paper. And I said, well, I replied to every single one. They didn't reverse themselves. They basically refused, right? And so then, I went public with it. I put it on my blog and 2 stories about the whole thing. And then I posted as a preprint immediately, right? And then we went to a different journal, got it peer reviewed one more time, and now it's published. But it was something unheard of at the time, right? I understand that it actually has happened a few times before, except I have never heard about it.
How long have you been studying IQ, and what motivated you to do this research?
I haven't been studying IQ, like IQ, but I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I have lots of sort of expertise in research methods and psychometrics. I also teach it, right? And I published some papers on rising IQ on verbal tests, sometimes in 2000 and so on, and a bunch of other things on assessment. But one motivation for this paper was that I sort of found out that clinical psychologists routinely use old tests, right? So today, you may go to a psychologist, let's say for vocational assessment, or God forbid, for fitness for duty assessment. And the psychologist will give you WAIS 4 IQ test, which was standardized in 2008. And then, because there are no data on how people in different occupations are doing, no current data, they dug out data from 1940s on white enlisted men enrolled in U.S. Army at the time of Second World War. And of course, those people were assessed with tests standardized in 1939, right? And then they pulled out another test, WAIS, in fact, from 1955, to which bunch of occupations were standardized to, right? And when you make that comparison, when you take the IQ from 2008 test and compare it to some mean IQ of some workers in 1939, you shaved off 20 or more IQ points from the person, right? You instantly make them look mentally challenged, even though they are not. It's a psychologist who has a little bit of a problem, right? And so then I was looking into it, and I, of course, found out that all these texts which psychologists use are repeating this myth that undergraduate students are smart, right? 115, 130. Because if you show up to the vocational psychologist, the psychologist will also add or think that you should have an IQ of 115. And when they find out that, your IQ is 105, they will somehow think that you somehow lost some IQ points, even though that they are forgetting that, in university, IQ is also normally distributed. So if it was 115, as it was in 1939 or 1940, well, plus minus 2 times 15 IQ points, those are the people in the university, right? So when the IQ in university was 120, you could still see students with 90 IQ. Today, you see students with IQ 70 or below in the universities. Because average is the average, but there's a huge variation around it. And so if, for example, you go to that vocational psychologist and, your vocation theoretically requires university degrees, and then the psychologists assume that you should have 115 or 120 IQ points. And if they measure 90, they think that you suffered some brain damage. Even though that's complete nonsense, right? And so then I looked into published scientific research, and what happens is that when WAIS, various versions of WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, are published, publishers typically, or at least so far, never provided IQs by education. Some other people analyze those standardization samples. So publisher allow them to study the standardization samples, and they actually publish the IQs on the standardization samples by education. And so first test this was done for was, we actually have this figure in a paper. It's a figure 3, right, where you can see how people with different education, namely having 13 to 15 years of education, meaning some college but not quite university degree, and people with 16 years of education who had university degrees, what happened to it across 3 versions of WAIS. I'm not aware of the data for WAIS in 1955. I'm also not aware for data for the first version of WAIS, which was published in 1939, right? But first data analysis was done for WAIS-R, and at that time, 1981, that's when that was published, the mean IQ of university graduates was 115.3. In 1997, they published WAIS-3, new revision, and the mean IQ was 111.6. 2008, they published WAIS-4, and the mean IQ was 107.4 of the graduates. Okay. Now, for those people who were in college but did not graduate, the WAIS-R in 1981 was 107 mean, 107.4. 1997 for WAIS-3 it was 103.6, and WAIS-4 standardized 2008 it was only 101.4. So there was a decline even for those people who got some college but did not graduate, right? And the standardization samples data include everybody, meaning any adult, from like 17 all the way to, 85 or something like that, right? And so those adults, of course, got a different educations too, because those people who are today 85, well, they probably, for them to have a university degree was an exception. Whereas for those who are today 20, that's normal almost, right? So we decided, okay, let's do the independent study on this. And we did the meta-analysis. And what we basically did was searching for the articles in scientific journals, which for some reason reported average WAIS IQ, right? And people reported because they want to describe their samples or because they are studying WAIS for some reason, for different reasons. And then you can tabulate those WAIS IQs by year of publication as a proxy for the year of assessment. And if you actually have a year of assessment, then you replace the publication by the year of assessment. It's your estimate. And what we found was that, yes, it went from something like 118 in That's a figure 9, right? That it went from 118 about down to 102. So it's an independent verification of what has happened to the IQ of undergraduate students.
What would you say are the main implications of this finding? If the average IQ of a college graduate with a bachelor's degree is 102, the question would, I mean, there's many questions, but like, what does this mean at the university level? What does it mean once you have the degree? As someone that wrote this study, what were your biggest implications for, say, society as a whole?
So we discussed 6 implications in a paper. As I said, I went into it more from that how is this IQ used by clinical psychologists, right? And of course, if clinical psychologists use 80 years old data to compare you to, that's just crazy, right? I can't. I don't know how I would describe it. I probably would have to use few swear words. But one implication is, of course, that today in the university, you are no longer teaching as a professor some selected group of students. Moreover, because that enrollment in the university increased so much, you are also teaching a group of students with much wider IQs. 1940s, your lowest kind of person in there might have had an IQ 90. Today, we are down to 70 or below, right? So we are teaching the span of, 60 IQ points or more than that, right? And that, of course, implies that you have to change what you actually teach. And it implies that you have to teach to the lower portion of that population, right? One way or the other, you will not be able to teach to everybody at the same time unless you are teaching to the lower portion, but the higher ability people will be somewhat bored, right? One thing which is related to this is that in many universities, probably the majority of the universities, professors are evaluated by so-called student evaluation of teaching, meaning at the end of the term, students give you some sort of evaluation, some sort of rating scales. And we know that those evaluations are basically measures of satisfaction. And the question is, will you be really satisfied if I give you F? Probably not. So there's a related concept over the last 80 years that it used to be the case 45 years ago, right? That average grade in the university was C. In fact, almost every calendar which you open today will still tell you that C is average and B is above average grade. But that's not true. Data after data show that, we are inflated up to A, and probably your most common grade is some kind of A range today, right? And that's a natural consequence of these pressures, right? So if you are evaluated as a professor by students, and that's a student satisfaction, that's not teaching effectiveness, meaning that's not, students don't learn more from the professors with higher SETs. I published a paper on that too, by the way. So that's one huge implication, right? One thing is standards went down. Another data show us that students study less. They used to study for every hour in class, they study 2 to 3 hours outside of a class. Today, they barely study an hour, right? So that went down. So grades don't reflect, ability anymore because it's just, they are not set to that sort of average C kind of standard, right? And that, of course, you can look at the implication for the employers. Employers used to use undergraduate degree some kind of an indicator of your above average ability. And of course, that's not true today. Today, having university degrees no longer signals that you are higher ability because the average IQ is somewhere around 102. So many employers basically stopped requiring university degrees, and instead they have some kind of assessment of their own. One of the interesting part is that even Government of Canada, one of the biggest employers in Canada, allows you to replace university degree by, I think, about 90 multiple choice question IQ test. And if you get about 60, you are good. It's equivalent to university degree. When you look at it that way, then it says, well, nobody expects anybody to learn anything in the university, so I may just as well give you just multiple choice tests on your IQ and let's see, right? The third implication we talk about is that when you are heading to the university, you cannot expect that you will be part of some sort of exclusive club, that you will learn something which other people won't, because it's no longer exclusive. Fourth implication is that all this misinformation in scientific literature needs to be corrected, and needs to be corrected pronto, right? Because it has a massive implication for causing harm to examinees in clinical settings, where people get wrong diagnoses, they are referred for disability, etc., even though they are not disabled, right? And, in a disability situation, if you are a clinical psychologist and you use these, you compare 2008 IQ straight to 1939 standardized test of white enlisted men in U.S. Army, then you shaved off those 20 plus IQ points from the person. And if it's a university educated person and you assume that they should have 115, then you dump them even more, right? And if a person is actually asking to be adjudicated as disabled and therefore eligible for government benefits, let's say, $22,000 in Alberta for people who qualify for disability per year, that person may be happy with the outcome. But Alberta taxpayers, when they learn about it, probably won't be too happy that they are spending, millions and millions of dollars to support their citizens who just didn't want to work, perhaps. And it also, of course, takes the money from people who are really disabled and who actually need the money. So it basically, it creates problems for the program, that the program is not doing what it was designed to do, right? To support people who actually need that support, right? And in other settings, it may end your career, right? Because if, for example, employer for some reason sends you for some kind of evaluation, and they may have some ulterior motives for that, and you show up in clinical psychologist office and they do this kind of comparison, well, they just terminated your career, right? Because employer will say, look, psychologist says that you are mentally impaired, so you can't do this job anymore, right? And this is true in, applications for police officers, fitness for any kind of fitness for duty evaluations, right? Where a person who is really victim of that kind of misinformation and nonsensical use of IQ scores, and so it ends their career, or they don't start their career, right? Simply because psychologists are not aware of the current scientific data on IQ and use these data from 80 years ago when the world was different, right? Then another one is, psychologists imagine that you suffer some kind of, you are in a car accident and you suffer some brain injury, right? And typically when people try to assess how much of an injury you have suffered, let's say for compensation purposes, for liability issues and so on and so forth, right? They try to figure out what your IQ was before the injury, right? And of course, then nobody measured it because you didn't have any need to have IQ assessed, right? So they use these primordial measures of IQ functioning, which are based on sort of idea that certain intellectual capacities remain kind of intact even if you suffer injury, right? Let's say knowledge of your words is a good example, right? Or pronunciation of the words. But those kinds of estimates are massively imprecise. They predict something from who knows when, based on some data. And so even if the data were current, they are imprecise. But now, because you took the scientific prediction of what your IQ was based on WAIS R, but you assess the person with WAIS 4, you can't compare that. Because there's a difference between how people do on WAIS 4 versus WAIS R, and it's huge, right? But psychologists take the prediction, they plug the equation in and they predict your IQ and they conclude you suffered big loss. When in fact, again, you didn't because of that Flynn effect, right? And of course, second thing, because what changed is the IQ in university. So in these predictions, people use your education as one predictor. But that education no longer has that power. So you are making it up as a psychologist because you are not aware that you shouldn't be using it because it's 30 or 40 or 50 or 70 or 80 years old, right? So premorbid IQs, all those equations out of the window, right? You can correct for it using a Flynn and you could correct for it for education, but it's a speculation, right? It's not really suitable for any high stakes decisions. One additional thing which is sort of implied from this newer research, right, is Longman and his colleague, who are also here in Calgary. They studied what happened to a relationship between education and IQ in US standardization sample versus Canadian standardization sample. We know for quite some time that Canadians score differently on the same test than US. Canadians typically outscore US population by about 4 or 5 IQ points. So we now from a WAIS 3 on, publisher does both US and Canadian norms, because you would be making lots of sort of mistakes if you were using different norms from different country in your country, right? So it's standardized now on both Canadians and US people. And part of the analysis which Longman did was that they looked at the relationship between WAIS scores, WAIS IQ, and education attainment. And in US, in 1997, when WAIS 3 was standardized, the effect of education is much higher. Median education is correlated with IQ, or was correlated with IQ in 1997 by about 0.5 number of years of education with IQ in United States standardization sample. In Canadian sample, the correlation was much smaller. So the relationship between education and IQ in Canadian standardization sample on WAIS 3 was much, much smaller. And so that again tells you that you cannot use the norms or findings from a different country than your own country, right? Because if you use it in Canada, you over-predict how smart a person with a university degree should be. And it's an error. They shouldn't, because in Canada, that relationship is much, much flatter. So you will again make the Canadian person, if you use a US norm, look stupider. Right? And again, psychologists don't seem to have an idea, right? So Pearson they published these advanced clinical solutions for WAIS 4. And they, of course, published it based on US sample. They didn't do it on Canadian sample. And Canadian psychologists use these ACS US advanced clinical solutions norms, and they use the prediction from US sample, which overpredicts what the person's IQ should be if they have a university degree. And they seem to be completely unaware that that's not psychometrically sound, that is based on data from a different country, which are not applicable in Canada, right? And nobody seems to be teaching them that. At least I can't find any, article which will say, well, don't do that kind of stuff, right? So I will have to write one. And then I think we said, so massive clinical education, massive sort of clinical implications, right? And sort of overall thing is, of course, right, that, when you are making these predictions in clinical practice, right, you really need to be aware of all these factors. Because if you are not, you are just producing misinformation, right? And harming people who have been subject to your assessment. And once you are subject of psychological assessment, to change it is almost impossible. Psychologists are almost like gods, right? In fact, there's a movement in clinical psychology that, nobody should see how the psychologists do this stuff, right? Only another psychologist. And the amount of error and wrong conclusion and so on in these reports, right, is just incredible. I have a blog about some of this stuff, right? And you can read about it, and it's insane.
In this piece that we're discussing, your data shows massive differences between the top and the bottom, but you also say that different universities have higher average IQs versus other universities, and the same thing with majors. I mean, a big difference between, I think you gave the example of physics versus education. And so when we're talking about like how can employers use this, like what are certain universities that you could use as like, oh, this person is an intelligent person or more so than the average, or is that difficult? Or what about majors? I would imagine that you don't see too many dumb physicists or rocket scientists or surgeons or something like that. I mean, I'd hope you wouldn't have a surgeon with an IQ of 70 actually cutting someone open. I just can't imagine them actually surviving 12 years of school to actually graduate, but maybe I'm wrong on that. What would you say on that?
If you look at those figures on a relationship between mean SAT scores, right? So SAT scores, people sort of say that's not an IQ test, that's kind of, aptitude test or something like that. But anything which, as I said, you can take the random words from dictionary. It will be very good estimate of your IQ, right? You can take 100 random facts about the world. And again, you score, did the person correctly say what it is, or did they not? You give them average score, standardize it to 100. And again, that's a very good estimate of IQ, because more sort of processing power you have, more ability you have, more you will read, more you will end up solving problems, more foresight you have, and so on and so forth, right? So it's all correlated. So SAT is basically intelligence test. It's not standardized in terms of IQ. It's standardized differently, right? But it's an intelligence test nevertheless. And so if you look at that figure 4, it gives you so-called mean SAT reading and math scores. And it gives you those average scores for different fields which people want to go to study in the university. So it's intended major. They are not in major yet. They are in high school, but they say what they want to study. And you can see this spread of ability, right? At the very top is, of course, mathematics and statistics. We know, and I mean, you cannot miss it in the media, that people are talking about problems with students not knowing the basic math and not having basic numeracy. right? Has been discussed, I don't know, ever since I have been in North America, as far as I remember, right? So it makes sense that things like, mathematics and statistics, you are basically 1.5 standard deviation above somebody who is going to education, right? And if you look at things like GRE, that's a figure 5, where you have a GRE verbal and GRE quantitative, and then you have those different fields to which people seek acceptance to, right? So again, you see this spread where on a quantitative, highest is the math, and then there's a physics, astronomy, engineering, banking, and so on and so forth. And somebody with, education elementary is close to the bottom, right? And social work at the very bottom. If you are looking on the verbal, well, the engineers might not be necessarily scoring highest on the GRE verbal, right? But people in philosophy are, right? And it makes sense. And of course, talking to your overall question, right? Is it possible that surgeon graduates with IQ 70? I think it's quite possible today, actually, right? But in certain fields, there's kind of immediate feedback on your inability. If you are an engineer and you design the bridge, and that bridge goes down when you put extra ream of paper on it, right? Or maybe it doesn't even start. Maybe you don't even finish building it because your pillars will crumble, right? So there is a feedback on your ability, and once you screw up once in that kind of a field, you are probably out. Whereas in fields like social work, there's basically no feedback on your ability or inability, and that's a big problem, right? Then there are some fields where there are national standardized tests, like nursing. And what that does is that now the university, which has a nursing department, is focusing on being good on those standardized tests. Assuming the standardized test measures something, relevant to nursing, then of course those departments are actually focusing on teaching you what you need to know to be a nurse, right? And it has one additional effect in the university, that nursing departments, for example, don't care very much about student evaluation of teaching. Because if you are a nurse faculty and you are teaching nurse students, if, for example, in a practicum they do something wrong, they are told right there and then, you did it wrong. I don't want you to do that ever again. Otherwise, you're out of the program, right? I've actually witnessed this once in a hospital myself. And so people in the departments where there are some standardized tests focus on teaching the relevant skills so that the department is known for producing competent nurses. Same thing as any other professional sort of education where there is some national standardized tests, right? It actually starts, all of these things starts much earlier, right? So in K9 or K12, it's already there, right? And it used to be the case that, if you were not doing well, you were repeating the grade. Today, people are basically passed through, no matter what they know, right? And so when they get to university, now you can read regularly media accounts of, some university somewhere has to, increase number of remedial courses because students don't know how to deal with fractions. Well, that's because K-12 didn't do its job, so to speak, right? There's an interesting phenomenon. I'm in Alberta, and Alberta is one of the provinces in Canada which still has standardized testing every few years in a K-12. And when students who graduate from high school in Alberta, they get some extra points when they are applying in universities elsewhere because of that.
What would you say if someone were to take your paper at the policy level? How should university change based on this information? Like what you'd recommend?
Some people have discussed this. It has been discussed quite a bit. So one consequence of this situation is that at least U.S. public confidence in higher education has just cratered. I think the last year it was about 39% or something like that. Some people say you can't change it. It's too established. You would have to change the whole system. It's impossible. You will need to close it all down and start over, right? But if you really were serious about changing things, you would probably need to bring in standardized testing, where you say, okay, so if you graduate with a degree with psychology, you must know this. And if you don't get the degree, right? Another really critical thing, I think, is you need to get rid of student evaluation of teaching as a principal mean of evaluating professors. I don't know what you know about student evaluation of teaching, but as I said, right, at the end of each course, students are asked to fill out some sort of questionnaire, right, where they rate professors on some kind of strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. And then somebody computes the averages. And then you are told whether you are satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And in some cases, especially like for people who are not tenured or people who are contract faculty, whether or not they get to teach next term depends on SETs and SETs only. So if that's your job description, if that's how you are evaluated, if that's your ultimate job description, what is the rational thing to do for somebody who wants to teach again? Well, my rational choice is to maximize my SETs. Because if I don't, I won't get the job again. And so what that leads to is decrease in standards, academic standards. You don't ask as much of students as you would normally ask. Something quantitative that's basically disappearing unless it's absolutely necessary, right? And you teach to the lowest common denominator, because the people at the bottom, if you actually make them unhappy, they will complain and they will bring your SET really down, right? So I think that has to go. The teaching has to be evaluated on, what do you actually do in class, right? Now, the problem is that, of course, is that no one has ever defined what effective teaching is. We know what ineffective teaching is. We have some faculty actually come to class and they basically read a chapter. Well, today some software can read it for you, right? So that's ineffective, and so on and so forth. But we also know today that these SET scores are unrelated to teaching effectiveness. That is what the students actually learn from the professor, right? And they are harmful to the education because people are decreasing the educational standards. They are decreasing amount of work which they require of their students, because students have that tool by which to modify your behavior.
I think in one of your papers that we're discussing about the grading of the teachers by the students, you mentioned that attractive teachers with lenient grading get higher scores. And also, was it like if you give treats out while you're giving students the, but if you're, was it, at least in the US, most of the professors are adjunct. So like you're mentioning, they're basically, contract or temporary. So if getting your contract renewed is based upon your score, of course you're going to inflate the grades because you won't be teaching next semester.
That's right. You have to. And most importantly, you must make sure that your grades are definitely not lower than other people's grades. Given that other people's grades on average are somewhere at A-, you must give A minuses, right? At least. So we discussed this in a different paper, right? But yes, it's a rational choice. And like in US, in Canada, I don't know what proportion of contract faculty is, but it's somewhere around 50%. Don't quote me on that number, but it's substantial.
At least in the US, I think Canada's fairly similar. But in 2008, the fertility rate of the US, of Canada, has gone down, which means that this past year, 2025, was the largest high school graduating class. And then every subsequent class now, so say for the 2026 school year, they're going to be smaller. And so I kind of look at, like, say, with the university, where you have, like, maybe in the 1980s, you had more of a consumer model where the student essentially is the customer and the customer is always right. But now, starting in 2026, where you're going to have less people going to university just because there's less high schoolers graduating every year for the next, for the foreseeable future. If you just look where the incentives are at, if you have less students, you're going to have the same number of universities fighting over these students. So it seems like it's actually, in the future, the problem will just end up getting worse. If you have 10% less students for years, then the university is going to be incentivized to make it as attractive as possible to get those students there, right? I mean, I think this is the whole reason too that a lot of the standards have decreased. These universities have just gotten so big, and the faculty, and there's so much admin that you need students to keep going. I mean, honestly, if you have an IQ of 70, you probably should flunk out of university right away, and the university would be doing the student a service, because now they're not taking on all this extra debt, whatnot. Maybe that student would never graduate anyways. They're just prolonging them being in school before they drop out. But you're not really doing that student a service by piling on this debt. I like, you're kind of doing harm to these students, but I don't see it changing just because you're going to have less customers in the future.
Yeah, that's a pretty obvious conclusion, I would say. And, what will happen depends on what's going to happen in the marketplace, right? So today, many university graduates with degrees from certain fields basically do not find a job where they can apply those, whatever they learned or didn't learn, to get some higher salaries, right? And they end up working in, service industry instead, for which they didn't need university degree in the first place, right? And so I can see that, we will still need lots of people with university degrees, but those degrees will have to actually mean something and teach something. Otherwise, that trend where employers design their own training programs, where they teach their new employees what they need to know in a span of 6 months or perhaps even 6 weeks, right? While universities take in 4 years and cost a lot of money, right? And at some point, maybe taxpayers won't be willing to actually pay the substantial part of that education.
You think we'll see a marketplace change then? Like, if you're a surgeon, like, yeah, maybe you need more education, or if you're a structural engineer. But if you're like a marketing major, the time you graduate from school, maybe a lot of the stuff that they taught you is already outdated. For that, maybe a 6-month program would be a lot better. I just don't know why, like, a lot of different majors are kind of lumped in with the same structure, because the difference between a physician and, say, marketing, there's just a lot of different focus for different majors and different timelines and things like that.
For a surgeon, absolutely, you need to know more, right? So it will take some time for you to learn it, right? Civil engineering, I think you must have some kind of, equivalent of university degree, which actually teaches you something. Many tools which people use today, of course, will be quickly outdated because there will be different tools. And so to the extent to which your university education just teaches you to use a few things, then that basically will become unimportant. But I would also say that, journalism, for example, if you want to be a competent journalist, then you probably need to study quite a bit. COVID was a nice example of this, right? So the universities today don't teach critical thinking anymore. You don't have, you can't have a debate because you can offend somebody. Students are afraid of each other discussing things. And so it's almost, kind of a little bit of one-way street. You are saying something and they either, absorb it or they don't, right? And getting students to debate things is difficult to start with, but it's also dangerous, right? Because if you say something which somehow somebody finds offensive, then they may go after you. Now, going back to COVID, CNN or major networks, where on the bottom of the screen you had, so many people died so far. So many people died so far. So many people died so far. And then there were journalists who said, okay, well, US is doing really, really poorly in managing COVID. I mean, look at the high number of deaths, right? And then BBC, for example, put out graphics where they showed, it was maybe 1 month or 2 months after the COVID started, and they had this nice bar graph where they had, US leading in number of deaths relative to all other G7 countries or, sort of Western countries, about 7 or 10 or whatever it was, right? And they put it out without saying that was a complete garbage data. The data themselves were good. The numbers, indeed. Many more people died in the United States than, let's say, in Germany or UK. But that's irrelevant because you need to adjust it per capita. United States is much, much bigger country than Germany or UK in terms of population. So in United States, any given day, many more people die of all causes than in Germany. It's an obvious thing, right? And so as a journalist, you should never put up a figure showing number of deaths unless, there might be some exceptional circumstances for it. But if you are looking at how country managed COVID, you need to adjust it per capita at minimum.
Yeah, because you're talking finish your thought. I'm sorry.
And this is not unique to COVID. This is we actually do this in healthcare, right? People do it per capita, right? No one would ever thought of, talk about the fact that more people in the United States have Alzheimer's than in Germany because United States has a 340 or 350 million people or whatever it is, and Germany has less than 100.
Yeah, you're talking population of Germany is around 83 million, and the population of the U.S. they have between 342 to 348 million, a massive difference.
And so one would assume that if somebody goes into journalism and they had some journalistic degree, they would have never done something like that, right? Because you mislead millions of people.
Kind of last big topic here, just out of curiosity, it wasn't really related to the paper, but just since you mentioned the Flynn effect quite a bit today, I mean, I've been reading going back years now that a lot of, say, Western countries since either the late 90s or the early 2000s, we've actually seen the reverse Flynn effect. So where they're actually seeing now a decrease of IQ. And from what I was, at least some of the research that I was reading, they kind of put it on the computer generation, with computers coming out, particularly in the late 90s, where people can't spell anymore. Well, of course, we get Microsoft Word with the spell check. And then, of course, who does math, where you're just using, whether it be, the T9 calculator, or now you use some AI system to do it. And then a lot of the schools kind of just got easier as they were wanting to get everyone to graduate high school and kind of pass people through. So maybe they weren't quite learning as much. So, I mean, is that actually true? Is the reverse Flynn effect actually observed in a lot of, say, first world countries, US, Canada, Norway, Denmark, or is that over exaggerated? What's your take on that?
I think there is something to it, right? I think within Canada and the US, the evidence is that Flynn effect continued at least to 2010, right? The WAIS 5 just came out a year ago, and it shows much smaller Flynn effect, but still Flynn effect, right? Only about 0.1 per year rather than 0.3, if I'm correct. It's simply much smaller, right? Let's put it this way. Then you also need to consider that intelligence tests ultimately are some collection of tasks which people do, which we summarize the scores on, standardize them to that 100 with standard deviation 15. And so now it depends a bit on which task you take. Okay? We have, talking about those vocational psychologists using outdated stuff, right? And so one of the things which people used, again, because it was done in 1940s, United States Employment Service designed this general aptitude test battery, okay? It has a bunch of tasks in it, and it's also a measure of intelligence. But each task is very speeded. You have like 6 minutes to do as many problems as you can. Okay? Talking about the calculators and all that stuff, we gave that test to university students, and we scored it according to Canadian norms, which were done in 1986 or 85. So in 1985, they gave this test to general working population. So not people who were in the university, just general working population. So you would assume that it's going to be fairly close to the sort of population standardization mean, right? But they didn't describe it very well either way. At the time, that test is standardized with standard deviation of 100. And mean 100 and standard deviation of 20. So it's different than IQ test, right? The IQ test standardized with 15, this test with 20. 10 years later, a professor or a graduate student in Lakehead University in Canada gave that test to a bunch of university students, and they scored half a standard deviation below the normative average. Okay? They didn't really talk about why. And when we gave it 2 years ago to our students, they scored 1 standard deviation on verbal below the average and 1.5 standard deviation below the normative average on numerical ability. What was part of the numerical ability? 2 speeded tests where they need to calculate, divide, subtract, long division, and so on. Well, in 1980s, calculators entered K-12. So as the calculators entered the education, and students were no longer required to acquire fluency in doing these tasks. They cannot possibly solve as many as people who were drilled multiplication tables, and they got homework and they had to do it at home, and they had to come back with, a bunch of sheets of calculations and so on. So people before 1985 did have fluency. Once the calculators appeared, the fluency disappeared, and the performance on that test cratered, right? And so I think you can't really assume that every performance on every test will go up just because there's a Flynn effect, right? Because it depends on what kind of a task. And the GAD-B, the General Aptitude Test Battery, is probably the nicest example of it all, right? Because it is a speeded test, so it doesn't really test your ability to do it, but it tests your fluency in doing it. And the fluency is catered as the opportunity to acquire fluency in school disappeared. And then, of course, on something like verbal things, it depends on changes in language too, right? So words may drop out of the language, new words may come in. And so when you are using older tests, who knows what it means, right? You really need to give it, you need to give an old test and new test to both, to a single group of people and see how they would score on previous norms versus today's norms. And so, I have no doubt that on some of these tests, it's actually reversed way earlier, right? Because of the task changes and fluency. Then another thing is that you are basically now probably at one of the highest points of saturation in educational attainment in society, right? As people realize that those degrees are not really helping them anywhere because employers will start ignoring them. I don't think we will achieve that 100% saturation that everybody will have a university degree, right? And so the massive changes in education have happened to a large degree, and we might be seeing a ceiling of that increase in ability due to getting more education. And of course, as more people go to education, then the standards in education goes down, people learn less. And then you take in all that other stuff about technology, which you mentioned, right? So spelling, well, I, ask my ChatGPT to check it for me or some Grammarly or something like that. And so then you don't acquire those same skills.
With AI coming into the picture now, maybe in 10 years, those tests will be pretty affected, I would imagine.
What do you mean?
Like, if you're using ChatGPT for everything, like nowadays, before you used a word processor to help you with spelling and you used a calculator, but now you're using ChatGPT to write your essays in every topic, and you're using Chat to do the math and Chat to do the emails and the outreach and build your resume. Now we're at this point where we could see like a major cratering because you kind of outsource all the activities to a device.
Maybe, but I would say that anybody who played around with ChatGPT or any of these AI systems, right? Those systems hallucinate. They make the stuff up, literally, right? And they are also only as good as the information they receive. Given the amount of misinformation which those systems receive, the conclusions of those systems is rather problematic in substantial portion of it, right? So ChatGPT AI may do some good in terms of trying to find some stuff and so on, but the human intelligence is still needed to actually see whether it makes any sense, whether it's in fact true, right? And some universities, there's some hint of it, are now going to oral exams, right? Where you cannot insert your ChatGPT answers. And this is interesting because I don't know how much you know about historically European education, but in many countries in Europe, when you went to university, you went through, you had to do a bunch of things, but your grades on that bunch of things were only determinative whether they allowed you to take the exam. And then you took the exam, and it may have been some combination of written and then definitely oral. And the only thing which counted for your university grade were those final exams. Right? So you went to lecture, you went to some tutorials, you had to hand in a bunch of stuff in and that kind of stuff. You had to get maybe attendance in the tutorials, or maybe you didn't, right? Depends on a particular place. But all that work during the term merely decided whether you were allowed to take the final exam. And the final exam, you were there, and the professor was there, and the professor was not looking what percentage you know. Professor was trying to find out if there's something you don't know. And if the professor found something you didn't know, then, well, if it was a minor stuff, they sort of, okay, you will get B, right? But if it was anything major, out. You need to try it again. And you had 1 or 2 tries, and if you didn't pass a second repeat, you were out of university.
How much different is the model of university in Europe versus, say, Canada or the U.S.? I mean, I have some friends that go to university in Europe. I mean, they're from Europe, but like they don't have the big sport teams like we have in the U.S., and their campuses are a lot smaller. One of my good friends, she's from Switzerland, and she was basically saying like, university is really cheap, but they also have really small classes. And because the government subsidizes a lot of it, they actually try to make it really challenging because they don't want the average person going to university. They only want the people that are smart and capable. So she's like, they're trying to flunk you out. Is that true? Or is that just Switzerland? Is that more standard across Europe? How would that compare to what we have in the US and Canada?
I'm probably a bad person to ask because, I have gone to university in Czechoslovakia, right? But it was a communist Czechoslovakia at the time. So to start with, to get to university, they basically took about, I don't know what it was, but 2-4%, 5%, right, of the people who sort of graduated with 12 years or something like that, right? But the system was this way, what I described, right? And I listened to audiobook by Malala. I don't know if you are familiar with her. She was from Pakistan, shot by Taliban, and then she attended Oxford University. And she actually describes that very same system in Oxford at the time she was there, right? So I was thinking, oh, interesting, right? So I know that it's in UK, it was the same, standards were much higher, right? What it is today, I don't know, right? If you read some of the stuff from UK, it has certain declined too, but hasn't declined to the level in, North America. I'm not sure.
Today's guest has been Professor Bob Uttl, who's a cognitive psychologist and professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary in Canada. So, Bob, just 2 final questions. One, just let people know where they can get a hold of you. And then secondly, leave us with a final thought related to this podcast, something that maybe we didn't discuss, or just a concluding thought to wrap it up.
So, yeah, I have a few blogs, actually, right? When I had that experience with Frontiers in Psychology, I decided to go public with it. So you can read about it, including all the emails and everything, at bobuttl.org, which is bobuttl.org. And if you are interested in what clinical psychologists do, I have a different kind of a blog, and it's sd5bc.info. So you can find lots of stuff there. Otherwise, of course, you can find me on Google and find my articles in different places. I can provide those links to those articles so that people can read them. They are not behind any paywall. They are published in open access.
And then leave us with a final thought.
We need to remove the misinformation about what is the IQ of undergraduate students. And I think we also need to somehow reform the universities so that they produce something desirable for employers.
Right. And as you mentioned, also with getting rid of those tests of a student, this would be a good place to start.
Yes, remove the student evaluation of teaching, evaluate professors on what they actually do. And I think it's difficult to evaluate professors because we don't have any agreement as to what effective teaching is, right? People can, again, read about it in one of my papers. But important thing is that we get rid of things which we know are harmful to education, like SCT, student evaluation of teaching, and we need to introduce some standards and enforce those standards.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.